In February 1993, the Chicago Police Board fired John Burge. The next morning, the Tribune and the Sun-Times ran it on the front page. The story was not new. It had been building for years in court transcripts and civil rights complaints, and the kind of reporting that lands in the newspaper and then gets buried under the next day's news. But now it was official. A Chicago police commander had been fired for torturing suspects. The board's ruling was careful in its language, deliberately vague about the full extent of what had occurred, but the word was there. Torture in the Chicago Police Department at a station on the South Side for years. That morning, 10 men were sitting on death row in Illinois. Their names had appeared in the same stories in various forms over the years. Each of them had said at trial and in appeals and in whatever ways a person on death row can make himself heard that they had been tortured into confessing, beaten, suffocated, electrocuted in the building where John Burge worked. Each of them had been disbelieved. Each of them was still waiting. Millions of Chicagoans read the front page that morning. They read the word torture. They read that the commander had been fired. They set down their coffee cups, folded the newspaper, and went to work. There were no significant protests, no demands for investigation from the churches, the universities, the bar associations. No legislators stood up to call for accountability. The city read the news and moved on. This is not a story about a small town that closed ranks to protect one of its own. This is a story about a city of 3 million people that looked directly at something and decided for 20 years that it did not need to act. About how a police station on the south side of Chicago ran a torture program for 2 decades, while the machinery of civic life, the courts, the newspapers, the elected officials, the institutions processed the information and produced silence. About what it takes and what it costs for a city to finally say, "We knew," and we did not do enough. To understand Area 2, you have to understand the South Side in 1972. Chicago in the early 1970s was a city under pressure from every direction. The Civil Rights era had opened wounds that had not closed. The Democratic National Convention of 1968, the police riots, the televised beatings in Grant Park had left a specific kind of damage to the relationship between the Chicago Police Department and large portions of the city it policed. Richard J. Daley, who had run the city like a machine for nearly 2 decades, was 3 years from his death. The gangs that had consolidated on the south and west sides after the urban upheavals of the 1960s were settling into their territories and their economies, and the violence that came with those territories was real and relentless and showed up in the statistics every year. The South Side in particular was a place where the city's resources and the city's attention moved differently than they did elsewhere. It was predominantly black, predominantly working class, and poor, the product of decades of segregation enforced by housing policy and bank lending practices, and the particular way that Chicago had always organized itself. The people who lived there had long understood that the police were not straightforwardly their protectors, that the relationship was more complicated than that had always been more complicated in ways that the city as a whole preferred not to examine. Area 2 was the police district headquarters that covered a large portion of the South Side. It sat on East 111th Street, a low, functional building that looked like what it was, a working police station in a working-class neighborhood. Detectives came and went. Cases were worked. Shift changes happened at the same hours every day. Coffee was made in the break room. To drive past it, you would see nothing remarkable. That was part of what made it possible that it looked like every other police station, that it sat in plain sight on a public street, that the people going in and out wore uniforms and carried badges and belonged to an institution the city had authorized to do exactly this kind of work. The building was not hidden. The address was in the phone book. The unremarkability of the place was one of its most important features. John Burge arrived at Area 2 in 1972, newly promoted to detective. He was 24 years old, a veteran of the Army Military Police who had served in Vietnam and Korea. He was large and physically imposing, with the bearing of someone who had spent years in institutional authority. He had a reputation even then as someone who got results, who could break a difficult case, who could get a suspect to talk when others couldn't. No one at the time asked how. The room is the thing that stays with you when you spend enough time with these cases. Not the building, not the precinct, not the city around it. The room, the interrogation room at Area 2, where the door closes and whatever happens next is between the detective and the person in the chair, with no camera, no lawyer, no witness who is not on the detective's side. Over the years from 1972 through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, more than 100 people would describe what happened to them in rooms like that one at Area 2. They came from different cases, different years, different circumstances. They had not coordinated their stories. They lived in different places, knew different people, had no particular reason to describe the same details in the same way. They described the same details in the same way. A metal box about the size of a small radio with wires attached. The wires were connected to the body, to fingers, to ears, to genitals. When the box was activated, the shock came. Not enough to kill. Enough to produce the specific total sensation of electricity moving through the body that no amount of preparation makes bearable. Enough that people would say years later that the sound of a certain kind of hum would bring it back. A plastic typewriter cover from the kind of typewriter that sat on desks in every office in Chicago in those years. Placed over the head, pressed tight. The air running out in the darkness inside the plastic. The panic that is older than language. The reflex of the body against suffocation that overrides everything else. Pulled away before unconsciousness. Put back. Pulled away. A telephone book thick and heavy in the way telephone books were in those years when everyone still used them. Used against the back, the sides of the head, the body. D. The technique of a person who has learned or been taught that a telephone book leaves bruises that do not photograph clearly, that do not tell a story that holds up in court. A gun placed against a temple or inside a mouth. The click of the hammer. Sometimes the chamber was loaded. Sometimes it was not. The person in the chair did not know which. These things happened in that building at the direction of or with the knowledge of John Burge over nearly 2 decades. The people who experienced them were overwhelmingly black men from the south side of Chicago. They were brought in for serious crimes, murders, armed robberies, crimes that the city needed solved, and that Burge's unit had a reputation for solving at a rate that impressed his superiors. The rate was high because the confessions were reliable. The confessions were reliable because once a person had been in that room long enough, they would sign whatever was put in front of them. The signed paper then moved through the system to prosecutors, to courtrooms, to juries who heard the defendant testify that the confession had been coerced, and heard the detectives testify that it had not, and who in most cases believed the detectives. And then to sentences, and then to cells, and in 10 cases to death row. Andrew Wilson was arrested in February 1982 for the murders of 2 Chicago police officers. The killings had shaken the department. 2 of their own shot in the line of duty, and the city was demanding answers. Wilson was brought to Area 2 and held there for interrogation under Burge's supervision. He was in that building for hours. When he emerged, he had confessed. What happened to Andrew Wilson in those hours was documented more thoroughly than almost any other case in the Burge archive, because Wilson did something that most people in his position did not do or could not do. He sued. He sued from prison with almost no resources and very little reason to believe it would lead anywhere, because it was the only instrument of truth left available to him. The lawsuit took years. It was fought and appealed and remanded and fought again. During its long passage through the federal courts, a prison physician who had examined Wilson shortly after his interrogation was deposed. He described the injuries he had documented: burns consistent with electrical shock on both sides of the head, burns consistent with cigarettes on the chest, lacerations, bruising on the face and body. He had taken photographs. The photographs were produced. The city's lawyers in the course of the litigation were eventually forced to admit in a federal proceeding that the evidence established in their words an astounding pattern or plan to torture certain suspects into confessing to crimes. An astounding pattern or plan. Those are the city's lawyers' words, not mine. Not a rogue detective. Not an isolated incident. A pattern. A plan. This admission was made in a legal proceeding, which means it went into the record, which means it was available to anyone who looked for it. The year was 1989. John Burge was still working, still commanding detectives, still producing confessions at a rate that his superiors found satisfactory. He would not be fired for another 4 years. The people who knew and who said so were not invisible or marginal. The attorneys who represented the men filing civil rights suits knew. They had been accumulating evidence since the early 1980s, the testimony of clients, the photographs of injuries, the patterns that became unmistakable once you had seen enough of them. Flint Taylor and the People's Law Office had been building cases against Burge for a decade before he was fired. The judges who heard the suppression hearings knew or had access to the information that would have allowed them to know. Some of them ruled in favor of the defendants who claimed torture. Most did not. The prosecutors who took the cases to trial knew that the defendants were claiming torture because the defendants said so in court. They argued against those claims. They won in case after case because the detective's word was more credible to juries than the defendant's word. The Chicago Tribune knew reporters had been covering the civil litigation and the appeals for years. The coverage was real, it was accurate, and it was insufficient to produce the kind of public reaction that might have ended things sooner. The stories ran. Other stories ran the next day. The city moved on. In 1990, the Chicago Police Department's own Office of Professional Standards completed an investigation of Area 2 and issued a report. The Goldston Report, as it came to be known, concluded that abuse at Area 2 under Burge was systematic and methodological, that it included psychological techniques and planned torture. The report was submitted to the police superintendent. It sat in a file for years. It was not released publicly. It was not acted upon. The superintendent who received it took no significant action. He was later appointed to a federal judgeship. In 1991, Amnesty International, the international human rights organization that monitors state torture in countries around the world, issued a report on the allegations at Area 2. They called for an inquiry. Mayor Richard M. Daley, who as Cook County State's attorney in the early 1980s had been advised that Burge and his men had tortured Andrew Wilson and had not initiated a criminal investigation, responded to the Amnesty International report with, according to the available record, no comment whatsoever. And in 1993, when the board finally fired Burge and the city finally read it on the front page, 10 men were on death row. Their names were in the paper. Their cases had been reported. The confessions that had put them there had been contested in court in hearing after hearing, year after year. The city folded the newspaper and went to work. One journalist who covered the story for years, John Conroy, writing for the Chicago Reader, wrote something about this that I have returned to many times. He said given the circulation of the daily papers and the reach of other Chicago media, it is safe to say that millions of Chicagoans now knew about the torture. And yet clergy universities, bar associations, legislators, and community groups were not clamoring for an investigation. That he wrote was a reflection of the indifference of the community. The indifference of the community. In a city of 3 million people, I want to sit with that phrase because I think it deserves more than a moment. The indifference of the community is not the same thing as ignorance. Ignorance is not knowing. Indifference is knowing and not acting. The distinction matters not to assign blame in some simple way, but to understand what actually happened. Chicago was not uninformed. Chicago was indifferent. Why? Part of the answer is geography. Area 2 was on the south side. The men who were tortured there were black men from poor neighborhoods. The city that read the front page in 1993 was not a unified city. It was a city divided by race and class and the particular geography of segregation that Chicago had enforced for generations. The torture of black men on the south side was not to a significant portion of that city a story about people like them. It was a story about people over there in those neighborhoods where those things happened. The emotional connection that turns information into outrage was harder to make across those distances. Part of the answer is the nature of the information itself. The claims of torture came from men who had been accused of serious crimes, murders in many cases. The instinct to disbelieve a person who says the police hurt them is strongest when the person saying it has been charged with something terrible. It is easy to believe that a guilty person will say anything. It is harder and requires a specific effort of the imagination to believe that an innocent person will sign a confession. Most people do not make that effort. Most people do not have to. And part of the answer, the part I find hardest to set down cleanly, is that the city had a use for what John Burge was doing. Not an acknowledged use, not a stated policy, but a functional use. The South Side was violent. The gang crime was real. The murders of those 2 police officers in 1982 were real. The city needed those cases closed. The confession rate at Area 2 closed them. The question of how the confessions were obtained was a question that for a long time the city collectively decided not to ask too loudly. That is not innocence. That is something else. The Death Row 10 organized from inside. They had almost nothing time, and the ability to pass messages, and the knowledge that their cases were connected in ways the outside world had not fully assembled. They called themselves the Death Row 10. They coordinated with attorneys. They wrote letters. They gave interviews to journalists who came to see them. They built from inside prison cells the case for their own exoneration, because no one outside was building it for them at the scale that the situation required. In December 2002, Governor George Ryan, a Republican who had come into office skeptical of the innocence claims and who over the course of his tenure had been persuaded otherwise by the evidence, declared a moratorium on executions in Illinois. He commissioned a study. The study found the system broken in ways that went beyond individual cases. On January 11, 2003, in the last days of his governorship, Ryan commuted the sentences of all 167 death row inmates in Illinois to life imprisonment. He also issued 4 full pardons to Aaron Patterson, Madison Hobley, Stanley Howard, and Leroy Orange, 4 men whose convictions rested on confessions extracted by torture at Area 2. At the press conference, Ryan said the Illinois capital punishment system is haunted by the demon of error. He was right. The demon had been there for 30 years, operating under fluorescent lights in a police station on East 111th Street, and the city had chosen for most of those years to let it work. John Burge was finally charged in 2008. Not with torture, because the statute of limitations had long since expired on those acts, but with perjury and obstruction of justice for lying about the torture in a 2003 civil deposition. He was convicted in 2010 and sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison. After serving 3 years, he was released. He returned to his home in Apollo Beach, Florida. He continued to receive his Chicago Police Department pension, approximately $3,000 per month, until his death in September 2018. He was 70 years old. The pension was not an oversight. Multiple attempts were made over the years to strip him of it. None succeeded. The city of Chicago, which in 2015 would pass the nation's first municipal reparations ordinance for police torture, survivors continued to pay the man who ran the torture program his retirement income until the day he died. The reparations ordinance passed under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who had spent years resisting it, provided $5.5 million to be distributed among survivors of Burge's torture, along with free city college tuition for survivors and their family members, free psychological counseling, and a formal apology from the city council. It also required that the history of the torture be taught in Chicago public schools. That last provision is the one I find most difficult to hold without complexity. The children of Chicago are now taught in their public school classrooms about what happened at Area 2. They learn about John Burge, about the confessions about the men on death row, about the city's long silence. They learn it as history. The history was made during the childhoods of their parents and grandparents, during the years when the Tribune ran the stories and the city moved on. The history was made by the indifference that Conroy described, by the geography of who mattered and who did not, by the specific calibration of civic concern that decided for 2 decades that what happened on the south side of Chicago could be processed and filed and not acted upon. The children are learning it now. That is something. It is not nothing. I have thought a great deal about what the Burge case asks of Chicago, and by extension of any large city that carries something like it. What happened here was not the silence of a tight community closing ranks, not neighbors protecting neighbors out of fear or loyalty, or the intimacy of people who have lived alongside each other for generations. Chicago's silence was something different in kind. It was the silence of distance, of a city large enough and divided enough that what happened in one part of it could be processed as news that happened to other people over there in that part of the city, in those neighborhoods, and then set aside. The racial geography of Chicago made this possible in a specific way. The South Side, where Area 2 sat and where the men who were tortured lived, was not the same city as the North Side lakefront neighborhoods where many of the editors and aldermen and university presidents and clergy lived. The distance between them was not only physical, it was the distance of segregation built over decades into the housing stock, the school districts, the political maps, the ordinary assumptions about whose problems belonged to the whole city and whose belonged only to the people experiencing them. That kind of silence does not require coordination. It requires only the ordinary operation of a divided city. The ordinary distances, the ordinary indifferences, the ordinary calibrations of who matters and who does not, baked into the infrastructure of a place that has never fully reckoned with how it was built. The reparations ordinance tried to address it. The school curriculum tries to address it. They are attempts to close a distance that was never closed in the years when closing it might have saved lives and spared decades of wrongful imprisonment. Whether those attempts are sufficient, whether they constitute the full accounting that the situation demands, is a question the city is still answering. It will be answering it for a long time. Leroy Orange was released from death row in 2003 after 19 years. In 2007, the city settled his civil rights suit for $5.5 million. He spoke at events. He advocated for other exonerees. He tried to do in the years he had left the things that 19 years on death row had prevented him from doing when he was young. He is alive. He carries what those years did to him the way anyone carries something that cannot be fully put down. John Burge is buried in Florida. His pension was paid in full. The room at Area 2 is gone. The building has been redeveloped. The wires and the plastic covers and the telephone books do not exist there anymore. What exists instead is the curriculum and the reparations fund, and the knowledge that a city of 3 million people read about this on a February morning in 1993 and folded the newspaper and went to work, and that the cost of that morning of all the mornings before it, when the information was available and the action was not taken, is still being paid by people who did not have the luxury of setting it down. The demon of error, Ryan called it. But error implies accident. What happened at Area 2 was not an accident. It was a choice made once by John Burge and remade every year for 2 decades by everyone who knew and decided that knowing was enough. It was not enough. It is never enough.